Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. He joins us now live from London. Been listening to all of that, no doubt, with interest. We have a bizarre situation here. Kimberly was saying that US politicians urging the president to do everything he can to de-escalate the situation. There's President Trump saying that Iran can never have nuclear weapons. Hang on a minute. It was the US that escalated this in the first place. Iran has always said that it doesn't want nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. I think we're now at a point where we need to accept the fact that maximum pressure doesn't work. And as most analysts have already said for months, that maximum pressure will not work on a regime such as the Iranian regime, which is a revolutionary one, which cannot show weakness. And I think the problem with maximum pressure is maximum pressure to what extent, to what effect, to what end. And I think what we just heard from the Defense Department here is maximum pressure works to a degree that it pressures the Iranians, but the Iranians don't really know to what end. What is it that we're trying to achieve with Iran? We're trying to pressure them back to the negotiation table. That was never going to work, particularly because the Iranians already felt like they made a sacrifice here with the JCPOA. They made concessions, and now, despite the fact that they were abiding by their deal, they nonetheless were faced and were actually punished with sanctions. So you actually, rightly say, the Americans were the ones that escalated in the first place. Now what the Iranians are trying to do is trying to push the boundaries, trying to see, how far they can actually go, where the red lines are for the Americans. And it is very, very difficult now. And I see, if we hear the debate on Capitol Hill right now between Republicans and Democrats, but also within the parties, between the White House and different departments in Washington, it becomes quite clear that it's difficult to come up with a coherent approach, because they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, we have to make sure that the Iranians don't do that again. We have to make sure the Iranians don't escalate further. We have to establish these red lines kind of with a lot of resolve and determination. But at the same time, we also don't want a military escalation in terms of a full-out war. So how do we do this without kind of crossing that threshold of war here? And that is the very, very difficult task. But the fact, and you alluded to that already, that the P-8 plane was targeted yesterday, and there were considerations in the Revolutionary Guard to actually down a plane with 35 US personnel on it. That would have been clearly an escalation that I think the Americans couldn't have accepted, and the Iranians also determined that this would have been too risky, so they went for a drone which is unmanned, but it was really pushing the boundary, in these Salami tactics to a way that we're just underneath the threshold of war now, and I feel the Iranians cannot escalate further. But what is needed now is a more diplomatic approach.
So the US has effectively created this crisis. It's blown out of all proportion to what Iran was supposed to have done. It was in compliance with the nuclear deal. It was the US that withdrew from it. Are we right to be skeptical about US motives? Are we right to be skeptical when the president says that he called off this attack with 10 minutes to go, this response to the downing of the drone?
I mean, yeah, there is. So this is all about deterrence right now, isn't it? And the problem with deterrence is it's based on capability and credibility. So how capable is the United States? Very capable, as the president said, most powerful military in the region. The problem here is with intent and motivation. To what extent is there a political will in Washington to escalate further and also bear the consequences of a retaliation from Iran? And I think that's where the problems come in. So, Qatar is hosting the biggest US airbase in the region. Qatar would be the first to be targeted because most of the strikes would be flown from there. The same would go for the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They would be on the absolute brink of that war. They would get the first barrage of ballistic missiles. So, and that would hit American strategic interests. So I don't see how the Americans would be interested in seeing that escalation through. The problem with the credibility, both militarily but also diplomatically, is that the Americans have never really spoken with one voice. The problem with the Trump administration is that there is no clear strategy, which hasn't been communicated effectively and coherently what the Americans want to achieve. So on the one hand, there is no credibility that the Americans would ever stick to any agreement. They have undermined that trust that they have built over years during the Obama years with the Iranians. And at the same time, there is also no credibility that the Americans are willing to take that capability that they have militarily and strike the Iranians. And that kind of schizophrenia is something where the Iranians are playing with at the moment. moment, and they have been so far been right to test the boundaries and have not ever faced any consequences.
Andreas, good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Studies Department at King's College London. He's joining us now live from London. What do you make of what you just heard there, Andreas? Members of Congress keen that the president de-escalates a situation that was entirely his administration's fault for escalating it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult and tough situation for the president here because he's been building up this maximum pressure campaign, which consisted of more sanctions, a war, a belligerent rhetoric for more than a year, and absolutely no sign of diplomacy. And now 1 year into that maximum pressure campaign, he's now offering a diplomatic solution for Iran out. But that's obviously not how it works when you're dealing with a revolutionary regime such as the Iranian one. The problem that Congress is facing, that the Americans are facing more widely, is coming to terms with a balancing act. On one hand, clearly marking and clearly sticking certain red lines up in the ground and saying, look, this is as far as you can go, but not further. At the same time, they don't want to escalate to an extent that the Iranians can actually respond and retaliate completely, creating a full-out war situation, which is neither the GCC countries nor the United States want. So that kind of balancing act is increasingly difficult, but it's remarkable how Trump, who is someone who's always been very impulsive in his decision-making, has actually shown restraint yesterday and saying that this is, or would have been, a very disproportionate response to the downing of an unmanned aircraft to basically cause human death. That kind of indicates to us that both the Iranians and the Americans are now at a point where they don't want to escalate further, where they understand that by pushing the envelope a bit further into the wrong direction, it can cause retaliation from the other side that neither the Iranians nor the Americans really want. But that in itself creates a situation, a very small window for diplomacy, I think, that needs to be exploited as soon as possible. The problem with that, however, is that so far the Americans have not done zero to actually build trust with the Iranians that could have been exploited now in opening back channels for diplomacy. I mean, the Qataris, the Omanis, the Japanese, they've all tried to open these back channels. But the issue being that obviously the Iranians don't really trust that the Americans are sincere with diplomacy. But right now we're at this pat situation, this on-par situation, where both sides can't escalate further. Both of them are kind of know that pressure is mounting. So potentially this is something where mediators should come in and say, look, let's sit down and let's talk.
What do we make of Iran's response to all that's happened of late? First of all, there's this row about where the drone was when it was shot down. Was it in international airspace? Was it was it in Iranian airspace? And then there's this other element that's come in, Iran saying that it refrained from engaging with another spy plane that was up there at the same time as the drone, which had people on board.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying. So if the Iranians right now, I think, are very much in the driver's seat. It's in their backyard. They control the area like no one else, both in the air, on land, and also in the maritime domain. So they have the choice who they attack and who they don't attack. And I think the decision to not shoot down a P-8 plane, which had 35 US personnel on board, shows that the Iranians also exercise restraint to a certain degree. Now, the question is, and everything the Iranians have done so far, by the way, also with the attacks on the tankers, was within the realm of plausible deniability. Obviously, yesterday's incident was yesterday's incident was no longer plausibly deniable. So the Iranians have already said they shot down that plane. But now it is on the brink of, one side is saying it was in international airspace, the other side, the Iranians, saying it was over their territory. But the fact here is that this kind of reconnaissance aircraft, even when operating outside Iranian airspace, obviously takes images and gathers intelligence within Iranian airspace and of Iranians on the ground. So in that respect, it is actually infringing on the sovereignty of Iran. So you could build a case around this and say, look, this was a threat. It was legitimate to shoot it down. But this is, all in the realm of plausible deniability. The Americans are saying it was an international airspace. The Iranians are saying it wasn't. But this is really not the point here. I think the point here is the Iranians are showing strength and resolve, and now it's for the Americans to respond to that. They have said, we're willing to do anything necessary, also military action, but we are at the moment, we don't have a target that would be on the same level in terms of escalation as shooting down an unmanned aircraft. But would the Iranians take one step further, potentially harming a human life? I think that the Americans are absolutely resolved and determined to take military action against Iran, wherever that may be.
Andreas, many thanks indeed. Andreas Krieg there in London.